In the last lecture, we talked about how Constantine embraced Christianity and why this happened. And the most significant moment in this is a moment described by the Christian historian Eusebius, where Eusebius describes Constantine having a vision before embarking on the campaign that would overthrow Maxentius and unify the western half of the Roman Empire under Constantine's control. And in this context, Constantine has a vision that is confirmed in a dream to be a vision of Christ. And following this, Constantine has his soldiers put the image of the sign that he saw in the heavens on their shields. And through a miraculous set of activities in the war with Maxentius, he ends up winning a battle that no one can particularly explain. And so Constantine's conversion to Christianity is something that makes a lot of sense on a personal level. But in some ways, Constantine's conversion to Christianity is only part of the really significant things that Constantine does to change the way the Roman state works and to fundamentally alter the history of the state moving forward. Because the embrace of Christianity starts a process, Constantine's embrace of Christianity starts a process through which the Roman Empire will eventually become first a majority Christian state and then a state in which Christianity is de facto the official religion for all Roman citizens. That takes a long time. But another step that Constantine takes almost immediately begins to have an effect on the way the Roman Empire works. And this gets down to, or comes down to, the almost megalomaniacal way that Constantine later in his life thought about himself. So the victory of Constantine over Maxentius gave Constantine control of the western half of the Roman Empire. But a victory beside the what was then the Greek city of Byzantium, at the place where, in essence, the Black Sea and the Mediterranean are joined, this was the victory, a naval victory, that unified the entire empire under Constantine's control. And Constantine understood the strategic significance of that location. The city of Byzantium, as you can see on this map, if you look where it says Pontus Euxinus and you look at the Mare Internum, they are joined by two narrow strips. One is the Dardanelles, one is the Bosphorus. And the narrowest point that joins them is what's now the space between the Asiatic and European parts of the modern city of Istanbul. This is the place that Constantine realizes has incredible strategic significance. And so, following the victory over Licinius at Byzantium, Constantine begins the construction of a new city, a city that he will call Constantinople, or the city of Constantine, on the site of the old city of Byzantium. Now, this is a very significant step because the location that Constantine chooses is a massively important location. Not only is this the place that joins the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, but it's also the place where the European and Asiatic sides of the Roman Empire are unified or close to being unified as well. This is the place where the crossings between Europe and Asia are easiest. But the other thing that's important about this location, as you can see from this map of Constantinople, is that Constantinople is surrounded on three sides by water. And it's water that moves very, very quickly. The Bosporus, in a sense, is like a downhill movement of water. The Black Sea, the water in the Black Sea moves downward toward the Mediterranean and it produces really fast currents. And so not only is Constantinople surrounded on three sides by water, but it is a very difficult city to attack by sea. You have to know how to manage those currents to be able to actually attack the city. But if you know how to manage those currents, the Golden Horn, what will become the major harbor of Constantinople, this is a wonderful location for people to use for trade. And so what Constantine realizes is that founding a major city on this site has incredible implications. It's something that is both incredibly advantageous for east-west and north-south trade. This is a city that once it's founded is destined to be rich just simply because of its location, but it is also a very easy to defend city. You need just one set of walls uh, that blocks approaches from the west, and you can defend the city against land attack and resupply it easily by ships. And the same is true of naval attack. A naval attack on the city of Constantinople cannot succeed without somebody also attacking from the land. And so this is immediately a very, very difficult city to attack. Um, and what you see is Constantine initially just builds out from the city of Byzantium. So if you look at the far right of this slide, you see the walls of the old city of Byzantium. And if you know Istanbul at all, the old city of Byzantium is effectively Topkapi Palace. It's a little bit bigger than that, but not much bigger than that. And so you see then the walls of Constantine that are built a number of miles to the west. So what Constantine has done is he's greatly expanded the old city of Byzantium, and then he's built in a series of significant roads. And then Constantine spends a lot of the 320s and 330s encouraging people to move to this city. Now, to get them to move to this city, Constantine also has to make the city attractive and appealing. And so, one of the things that Constantine does is he imports all sorts of art from around the Mediterranean world. He imports, for example, this is the Serpent Column. You can now, if you go to Istanbul and walk through the Hippodrome area, you can see this. It's still on display. The Serpent Column was originally erected at Delphi to celebrate the Greek victory over the Persians in the 5th century BC. But this is only a small part of the artwork that Constantine brings into the city to make his new city of Constantinople attractive to people. We're also told that Constantine sponsors all kinds of building initiatives. He provides financial support to people who want to move to the city of Constantinople. And this then becomes very quickly a kind of instant capital that Constantine names after himself. But other emperors had done this before. The Emperor Philip the Arab had built a city named after himself in the Syrian desert. That city thrived for the better part of 25 years, and then it collapsed. The Emperor Hadrian does similar things. This is different because the city of Constantinople is so well sited. It's so strategically placed that the city of Constantinople is not just a kind of one-off thing that lasts for 25 years and then people forget about it. The city of Constantinople will become the center of Roman power in the East and will remain that way for 1100 years. And then after the fall of the Roman Empire / Byzantine Empire in 1453, it will then become the capital of the Ottoman Empire for another almost 500 years. So Constantine creates one of the world's great cities by doing this, and it happens almost immediately. And so this is something that is also important. Constantine does set the empire on a path towards Christianity, but Constantine also creates this parallel administrative structure where there is now an eastern capital and a western capital. And within 50 years, Constantine's vision for the city of Constantinople is realized. So what we have with Constantine are two big steps that change the course of Roman history in very fundamental ways. Now, if we return to Constantine's Christianity, it's clear that Constantine was attracted to Christianity on a personal level. He did feel like the Christian God was the God that was most aligned with him and a God that had championed him and helped him out. Now, it's clear that Constantine's embrace of Christianity on one level was done out of conviction and not because of a particular set of political calculations. There are not enough Christians in the empire for an emperor to reign as the champion of Christianity. When Constantine converts, there are perhaps 10% of the empire's population that are Christian. But there is something appealing about the way the church is structured that makes this conversion to Christianity something that opens a way for Constantine to talk about imperial power that is new and is advantageous. Christianity is, of course, a monotheistic religion. There's one God, and there is a church structure that's designed to emphasize and bring people into the worship of that one God. And that church structure is important to Constantine because Constantine, of course, is coming out of a tetrarchic environment where there had been four emperors. And Constantine is very interested in coming up with a new way to talk about imperial power that again emphasizes the old idea of there being one emperor, one singular emperor. And this is something that you see Constantine already trying on before he launches the campaign against Maxentius. This idea that Constantine promotes that he was descended from the Emperor Claudius Gothicus is a variation of this. Claudius Gothicus, of course, reigned alone, and if you're looking to overthrow the Tetrarchy, it's important to be able to say that you have some level of authority that comes from emperors who did reign alone. But there's also a religious component to this idea of a unified imperial structure that particularly appealed to Constantine, and it appealed to other emperors as well. So in the 270s, for example, we know that the Emperor Aurelian begins his reign in 270 as the emperor of the central part of the Roman Empire, with a Gallic Empire to his west and the Empire of Palmyra to his east. And what Aurelian does is he launches campaigns against the two empires, conquers both the Gallic Empire and the Palmyrian Empire, and after he does this, starting in 273, we see coins like this issued, where Aurelian explicitly identifies himself with the god Sol Invictus, the unvanquished sun god. And what you see in this coin is Sol Invictus, of course, standing above captives, captives that represent the world that Aurelian has unified. This is particularly appealing to Aurelian because it gives him a way to speak about the unification under his own sole authority of an empire that had been divided under the control of other people. And other emperors follow this. So, for example, the Emperor Probus, who follows Aurelian. Aurelian dies in 275. There are two short-lived emperors between him and Probus, and then Probus reigns from 276 to 282. We see Probus particularly interested in this idea of Sol Invictus as well. Now, why does that matter? Well, for Constantine, after the victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he is, of course, a Christian. But his embrace of Christianity officially in the images that he sends out to the world, this is not happening yet. Instead, Constantine, who is looking to unify the empire, does this and expresses this by going back to these 3rd century ideas of the emperor and Sol Invictus. And so you see, for example, this gold medallion that Constantine issues following his victory over Maxentius in 313. And you see the legend here, what Constantine describes himself as, the Invictus Constantinus, the unvanquished Constantine, Maximus Augustus, Supreme Augustus. And so this is the language of somebody who is, again, embracing this idea of one emperor in charge of one empire. And if you look at the shield on this gold medallion, what you see is an image of Sol Invictus in his chariot, 4-horse chariot, 2 horses on each side. Now look at this coin of Probus. Same image, Sol Invictus in his chariot, 4 horses, 2 horses on each side. Constantine is visually quoting these images of Sol Invictus that have appeared on 3rd century coinage that was issued before the Tetrarchy. And so what Constantine is doing already is trying on images for a supreme imperial authority where he stands alone. Now, as Constantine's reign progresses and as he defeats Licinius and as he unifies the empire, what we see is this Sol Invictus imagery drop away. But the idea of Constantine as a supreme sovereign, as the sole individual person in charge of this unified Roman Empire, is something that he continues to embrace. And Christianity gives him a way to both express this in a new fashion and also use an infrastructure that already exists to articulate these ideas. Because what Christianity provides Constantine is a monotheistic religion with a supreme God, similar to Sol Invictus, an idea of a supreme God, except in this case, there is only one God. There is a supreme God and there's not other gods. And so that takes this language of a supreme God even further. Because in the way that, say, Probus or Aurelian is using Sol Invictus, Sol Invictus is the supreme God among other gods. But for Constantine, the idea of one God and only one God that stands above all others, this is something that Constantine quite personally feels to be true, but it's also something that is quite appealing to Constantine. And Constantine actually even, we have an oration that Constantine delivers where he says explicitly, religion began with one God. And paganism is something, polytheism is something that degenerated from that. And I am going to try to bring the world back to this pure, original religion with one God. And of course, this is something that has a political analog. Constantine began as one emperor among four. But now he wants to be the sole emperor, the emperor who brings everything back together in a unified way, just as it had been before. And so the theory that Constantine is able to work off of, and that the Christian bishops who support him are able to work off of, is that the Roman Empire is, in a sense, a metaphor for the cosmic reality where there is one supreme God. So one supreme God, one supreme emperor. And the theory would be that Christianity gives Constantine a sort of political assist by providing a network and an empire spanning network of clergy who can both explain the nature of this supreme God that Constantine believes is the supreme God. Personally and quite convincingly believes this. But this network of priests and clergy can also explain how one God and one emperor can work together to make the world a better place than it has ever been before. And so the theory that Constantine is working off of is there's one church, there's one emperor, and they can support each other. And in so doing, they can bring the world back to the worship of this one original true God. But the reality is much more complicated because the Christian church is not one church. And Constantine, it seems, on some level, did not really understand this. And there are a lot of things that Constantine did that created and sort of heightened the consequences of the division in the Christian world. And so, even just in the fourth century, even just in the period between 300 and about 320, we see a number of things arise that show the division in the Christian church. So, when Constantine embraces Christianity in the 310s, he walks in the middle of two kind of raging fights about who should be in charge of the church and what Christians actually should believe. So, one of these fights is something called the Donatist Schism. And the Donatist Schism is something that happens in North Africa, and it's really confined to North Africa, really centered around the city of Carthage. And the Donatist Schism was provoked by the Great Persecution, initiated by Diocletian and Galerius. In that persecution, one of the bishops, the bishop of Carthage, a man named Caecilianus, was accused by other clergymen in his church of being too willing to cooperate with the Great Persecution, turning over books that the empire required him to do. And they felt that Donatus, who was one of these clergymen, felt that Caecilianus had been too eager to give up church property to imperial officials who asked for it, and they expected that he would have taken a much more hard line. And when the property was requested, he would have refused and suffered martyrdom because this is what Christians should do. So in protest of Caecilianus's activities, they elected supporters of Donatus elected Donatus as a kind of alternative bishop of Carthage. And they did this because, unlike Caecilianus, Donatus had actually been imprisoned, he had refused to cooperate with the persecution, and he had suffered under the persecution. Now, it would seem easy enough to resolve this, right? You have two bishops of Carthage. And so you can bring people together and you can have them hash out some kind of a compromise agreement. And as long as you bring that church back together, it doesn't particularly matter. And so the North African church summoned two councils in 313 and 314 to try to deal with the problem. And these councils decided that Donatists should have to step down. But the problem with this kind of a division is once it has arisen and one side takes pride in being a kind of hard line, um, uncompromising center of resistance, you cannot actually create a compromise very easily. And Donatus was the sort of person who, now that he had gone to prison and suffered for his convictions, was not likely to back down very easily. And so he didn't back down very easily. He refused to step down. And when he refused, there was a great consequence because in 314, Constantine had just begun returning property to the churches and giving imperial resources to the Christian church. And so now, instead of Christians figuring this out on their own, and each of them perhaps creating their own communities that might die out or might come back together, now the imperial government was deciding what was the legitimate church and who would get all of this money. Now that property was going back to the churches, it mattered who was considered the church by the emperor. And now that money was being given to bishops and being given to churches, it mattered who was declared to be the actual legitimate church by the emperor. And so Constantine and his agents gave money to the non-Donatists. And this only heightened the conflict because now, in essence, one group was favored, and the other group, a group led by Donatists, who had particularly been interested in saying that they resisted imperial pressure, now had more imperial pressure to resist. And Constantine actually made things worse because Constantine eventually sent the army in to try to solve this problem. And of course, that did not solve the problem. Instead, what you get is a separate Donatist church hierarchy, a church hierarchy that is centered on this idea of resistance. And it's centered on this idea of resistance in such a way that it cannot come back together with the original imperially favored church. And so as time passed, Donatists and non-Donatist Catholics actually degenerate, their conflicts actually degenerate into kind of running battles in cities and in the countryside. And these continue for centuries. And so Constantine's embrace of Christianity, far from creating a unified church, actually amplifies the divisions in the church in North Africa to a really dangerous degree. And so this was a brief lesson to Constantine in how complicated these disputes within the church could actually become. But even more complicated and even more widely significant was a conflict that begins in the city of Alexandria. This is what's called the Arian Heresy. Now, or the Arian Controversy. Now, before we begin on the Aryan controversy, it's important to emphasize that this has nothing to do with Hitler. Aryans, in this context, are spelled Arians. Aryans in the Hitler context are spelled Aryans. So these are completely different from the Aryans of Nazi propaganda. The Aryan Christians, as they're described in antiquity, are instead a set of followers who adhere to a set of doctrines that are attributed to a man named Arius, hence the name Aryans. And the 4th century Aryans are vaguely attached to the teaching of this particular individual. Now, Arius comes from the city of Alexandria. So if you look at your map, you see Egyptus, and then you see the Nile Delta. And at the far western end of the Nile Delta is the city of Alexandria. This is what the city looked like in antiquity. And so the light sort of yellow color, this is the ancient coastline and the ancient sort of areas under the ancient areas of the city of Alexandria. And The city of Alexandria was an incredibly special place. This is Alexandria now. The city of Alexandria, as you can see from the modern reconstruction, has a canal that links it to the Nile. But the city of Alexandria also has two natural harbors. You can see the one on the right and then the one on the left. And these natural harbors link it to the Mediterranean. Now, beneath it, you also see a couple of lakes. And so Alexandria was an incredible city in that it functioned almost like an island, but it had great port facilities that linked, the Mediterranean. So there was a military harbor and a commercial harbor. There's also a freshwater lake, so an abundant water supply. And the canal that linked Alexandria to the Nile meant that trade from as far as the Indian Ocean would come to Alexandria and be offloaded and then put on other vessels that would go out to the Mediterranean. And so Alexandria is a city with basically three ports: a freshwater port to its south and two other ports to its north. But it also was a city that existed in a very, very compact space. Um, all of the water around the city of Alexandria meant that it was almost effectively an island. And so we're told that the city of Alexandria probably had about 500,000 people in an incredibly densely packed space. And some of the texts that we have that come from Alexandria say that the thing, among all other things, the thing that most demonstrated your wealth and your prosperity in Alexandria was a house that you occupied by yourself with a garden, because open space at a premium, that most people lived in apartment blocks, 6, 7, 8-story apartment blocks, and only very rich people even had enough space for some fruit trees in a garden inside their house. Um, so Arius was a presbyter in a church in the city of Alexandria. Alexandria was probably the first major city to be Christian majority. It probably flipped to Christian majority around 350, so about 15 years after the death of Constantine. And so being a presbyter in the city of Alexandria meant that he is in charge of one church in the city. He led its liturgy, and this is a rapidly growing Christian population. And so, what Arius and other priests or other presbyters in Alexandria could do was they attracted their own kind of constituency. And the constituency that Arius attracted was a group of, it seems, a group of intellectually minded, Greek speaking Christians who were very interested in thinking about Christianity in a way that corresponded to their education in Greek philosophy, and in particular, their education in Platonic philosophy. And this is important because Arius saw himself as part of a teaching tradition that had a long standing presence in Alexandria. Some of the most important theologians that we see interacting with Greek philosophy and biblical texts come from Alexandria. There's the Jewish philosopher Philo, who combined Old Testament understandings and Old Testament texts with Platonic interpretation. But then, starting in the second century AD, you have teachers like Clement of Alexandria and Origen who go really deeply into the philosophical implications of Christian thought. And so there's a very robust culture of thinking philosophically about what Christianity means. And Arius is just, when he starts teaching these things in the early fourth century, the latest in a tradition that goes back in some fashion in Christian communities for more than 100 years. Um, and so we can understand why Arius is doing what he's doing. And in the second century and in the third century, where Christianity again is kind of operating in this wild west, where there is no state entity saying, this is the church and all these other people who claim to be Christian are not, there's plenty of space for people to do what Arius was doing. And so Arius, as a teacher of philosophically infused Christianity, gave weekly lectures, or gave twice weekly lectures on biblical interpretation. And so his main job was to conduct liturgy and to sort of serve um, to serve his community by offering Christian sacraments. But he would give kind of Bible study 2 times a week at his church, and people would come and listen to this. And in these lectures, Arius explained his ideas about Christ. Now, this is not an exceptional thing. Lots of people in Alexandria did this. Lots of people now do this. But one thing that Arius talked about got him into some real trouble, because Arius, following in the kinds of speculations the Platonists like to engage in, began talking about the nature of God and the nature of Christ. And as he was doing this, Arius said 2 really objectionable things, at least to some Christians. First, he talked about the creation of Christ. And what Arius said was basically this: God alone has neither equal nor like. No one is comparable in glory. We call God unbegotten because of the one in nature who was begotten. We adore God as eternal because of the one born in time. We raise hymns to him as unbegun because of him who has beginning. The unbegun appointed the Son to be the beginning of things begotten, and he bore him as his own son, in this case giving birth. This Son has nothing proper to God in his personal identity, for he is neither equal nor of the same nature of God as God. Now, this is a very elusive thing, and in Greek, this is actually poetic. It's actually poetry. But what Arius is saying deep down is something that is very important to understand. Arius is saying that God and God alone stands outside of time, and God therefore has a primacy over Jesus. Jesus was created. Jesus existed at the beginning of time. But Jesus is not eternal because Jesus was created. Jesus came from God. And so Arius says, God is eternal. God exists outside of time. God is his own unique nature, and Jesus is different from him, and Jesus is less than him. Not because Jesus is not a God, but because Jesus derives from God. And therefore, God must be superior to Jesus, not equal to Jesus, and not of the same nature as Jesus. And so this is the first thing that Arius is saying. And the background here is really important. The Platonic tradition that Arius is working off of works off of this idea that there is a supreme entity, a supreme sort of all-unified God, and the supremacy of this God comes from the fact that he is completely different from the world, and his supremacy comes from the fact that everything else derives from him. And so the very nature of that God and the very supremacy of that God is defined by the fact that things derive from him. He can't be supreme unless there is this process of derivation from him. And so the creation of Jesus then is something that actually affirms the supremacy of God. It doesn't in a way kind of diminish Jesus, but it affirms the supremacy of God. And so what Arius is saying is that God is so distinct from the world and must be so distinct from the world that you can't have him sharing identities with anything else. To do that diminishes God. And so Arius says Jesus was derived from God, and derived from God with the express purpose of creating the world. And Christ is still divine. He's still older than the world. He's still superior to the world because he created it. But there's another point that, of course, this is going to create problems for Christians who are interested in the idea of a Trinity that said that God has kind of 3 features. God is Jesus, and God is the Holy Spirit. And if Arius is saying, well, there's God and then there's everything else, that has problems, or that creates problems for Christians who believe in a unified Trinity. Arius also makes another point concerning the nature of Christ. And so Arius says there is a Trinity, but the glory in this Trinity is not alike, because the existence of the 3 elements of this Trinity are not mixable with each other. One is more glorious than the other by an infinity of glories, and the Father is therefore foreign in nature to the Son because he exists without beginning. So the key word here is ousia. And the way this is usually translated is nature, but it actually means something even more kind of basic and abstract. It means being. It comes from the verb to be. And so Christ exists differently. his being, his very essence, his nature, is different from God's. And so what Arius is saying is there is a Trinity. There's absolutely a Trinity. But within that Trinity, there's God who just is on a different level. He just is something different. His very basic being is different from that of the others. It's infinitely more glorious than the other element, than the glory attached to the other elements of the Trinity. And so this is a bit of an issue. This is not even a bit of an issue. This is a significant issue for the way that some Christians think about Christ and the sacrifice that Christ made. Because very basically, for a lot of Christians, there is this idea that God becomes human, takes on flesh, and is killed on earth to unlock the salvation of people. This sacrifice, God taking flesh and dying, is something all the way back to the New Testament, all the way back to the book of Matthew. This is the promise that Christianity offers to Christians. They are now able to achieve and enjoy eternal life because of this sacrifice that God made. But if Christ is not God, if their essence is different, then what does that sacrifice mean? Is the promise the New Testament offers something that actually is not achievable? And so there's a real problem with what Arius is saying for a lot of Christians. And Arius goes even further. Arius goes on to say, in essence, that not only is Christ different from God, he cannot even understand God. His nature, his being, his ousia is so different from God that there is not even the ability for Christ to understand God. And this again is actually very good Platonic philosophy applied to a Christian question. But it is also, again, a very dangerous idea given what a lot of Christians were taught to think about the promise the Old Testament makes them. And so this is a real issue that a lot of Christians confront. Because if Christ is not the same as God, then God was not actually incarnated to save the world. Just Christ, just this aspect, this sort of secondary created thing, that was incarnated to save the world, but not God. But there are advantages that come along with this too. Because if Christ is more like a man, then the great things that Christ did are not impossible for men to replicate. They are not so distant from the world that they belong to God and not man. Instead, if Christ is more like a man, if his nature is a lot closer to that of a man, then men can aspire to do what Christ did. And so what Arius has created is an idea that God is remote, but Christ is more familiar. Versus the traditional way that this had been described by many Christians was that Christ and God are basically on the same level, and when Christ comes into this world and suffers and dies, this is God coming into this world to kind of unlock a future for Christians. But God remains remote. And for Arius, God is much more remote than this other way of seeing the incarnation. But Christ is less remote and therefore more accessible. And the example of Christ is therefore more accessible. And so this made Arius's ideas popular because it makes salvation seem closer. It makes salvation seem more doable. Not impossible, but something that is achievable for someone who is fully human. At first, this is an Alexandrian controversy. The Bishop of Alexandria hears that Arius is teaching this kind of stuff. The Bishop of Alexandria then gets upset because he realizes the implication that this could have for the promise of salvation, and he tells Arius to stop. And as Arius is superior in the hierarchy of the Alexandrian Church, in theory, Arius is supposed to stop. But again, Arius is, at this moment, working not in the Christian world of Constantine. He's working in this old Christian world where the church kind of existed in this little piece of the church, but the hierarchy was not particularly strong. And bishops did have superiority, but there was no imperial framework that supported that authority. And so when Arius is asked to stop teaching this, Arius refuses. And then when he's asked more strongly to stop this, Arius goes on the offensive. In the Thalia, Arius tells us, in accordance with the faith of the elect of God's servants, God's sage servants, holy and orthodox who've received God's Holy Spirit, I learned these things from participants in wisdom, skillful and taught by God in every way. And so what Arius says to the bishop is, yes, okay, you in some worldly way are my superior. You have an office that's superior to my office, but I don't care. Because I have learned these things from people who are wiser than you, by people who have been instructed directly by God's Holy Spirit. And because of that, I don't need to listen to you, because you are not instructed by God's Holy Spirit. You have an office, but I have divine inspiration. And I know what I'm saying is right and what you're saying is wrong. And because I have divine inspiration, I don't need to listen to you. Now, this is an argument that also has deep Christian antecedents. Paul, for example, makes this same kind of claim. He says there are all kinds of Christian teachers out there, but I am the one that God has chosen. I am the one that speaks with the power of the Holy Spirit. I am the one who speaks truth because I am the one that is closest to the inspiration that comes from God. And so what Arius is doing here is taking an argument that also has deep Christian precedents. And the Pauline argument is an argument that a lot of these Alexandrian teachers could have used in the past as well, to say, I know what I'm talking about because I have a wisdom that comes directly from God. And so your office and the fact that you're a bishop and I am not doesn't actually mean what you think it means, because there is a different way to talk about authority in the church. Authority can be based on offices, but it should be based on who is inspired by a tradition that comes from the Holy Spirit. And Arius, being a rather combative fellow, then lines up a number of bishops who agree with him, and they back him up and hold their own kind of counsel to counteract the demands that come from the Bishop of Alexandria. And this is the controversy that Constantine walks into. Because this flares up just as Constantine has defeated Licinius and taken control of the East. And so not long after this, Constantine learns about this conflict. He learns about this conflict that started between two people working in the city of Alexandria. But because Arius had brought in bishops from Libya, it now was quickly spreading across a lot of the Eastern Mediterranean. And the lines between people who supported the authority of the bishop and people who supported this idea of an inspired way of teaching Christianity were already becoming drawn in significant ways and creating significant divisions that Constantine understood as a Christian emperor he needed to try to bridge. And so upon taking control of the East, Constantine called the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council, made up of bishops from around the empire, to discuss the Arian controversy. And what the Council of Nicaea decided was the following, and this is a creed that still to this day is recited in Christian churches around the world. The Nicene Creed said, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten of the Father, only begotten, that is from the substance of the Father, God from God, light from light, God from very God, begotten, not made, consubstantial, of the same nature, homoousios, with the Father, by whom all things were made, both things in heaven and in earth. Now, what's interesting about this creed is this creed represents a watershed in how church conflict was decided. When we see councils, church councils in the 3rd century, the idea that these church councils has is that you want to bring everybody together, you want to talk about the problem, and you want to come up with some kind of compromise that solves the breach in the church. And in the 3rd century, where the church and the government are completely separate, that's fine. But in a world where one church, one God, and one emperor are supposed to work together, and this is the world that Constantine wants the Roman Empire to become, this idea of sort of gently moving people towards compromise and having that compromise take as long as it takes to reach, this is something that Constantine really cannot accept, in part because of the idea of who is the real church, who gets the benefits that come from it. Now, much of the Nicene Creed would have worked for both followers of Arius and his opponents. What you see in this is the idea that, for example, the Nicene Creed affirms that Christ is begotten of the Father, as Arius says, only begotten. But it says that he is begotten from the substance of the Father. And this is vague. It's something that Arius could accept, because you don't talk about the nature of the Father. You talk about the substance of the Father. What we see is that God from God, light from light, very God from very God, all of this is stuff that Arius could accept as long as you don't define your terms. Begotten, not made. Again, Arius can accept that because it's not a physical presence of Christ. Christ is begotten. He derives from God. But then we get to this clause, consubstantial with the Father, homoousios with the Father. And this, we're told by our sources, did not come from the bishops. Constantine added that phrase. And that phrase, in fact, that word, homoousios, this becomes something that Arians cannot accept. Because what Constantine did here is instead of allowing the Nicene Creed to be a vague statement of common principles that could bring everyone back together and make the discussion, make basically the bishops stop talking about, and the clergy stop talking about the ousia, Constantine inserts this idea as his dictate that resolves the conflict. And of course, it cannot resolve the conflict. This is Constantine trying to place a firm stand that says, okay, now we're done. Stop talking about this. I have said that Christ and God have the same ousia, therefore they have the same ousia, so you guys just stop. And of course, this won't work. This is not how Christian clergy and bishops had resolved their conflicts in the past. And when this clause is added, Constantine draws a line between people who can accept the creed and people who cannot accept the creed, people who can accept the teaching of Arius and people who cannot accept the teaching of Arius. What could have been acceptable to Arians with the addition of this clause creates division that is not breachable. And Constantine did this on purpose, out of this idea of one God, one church, one emperor, and the emperor has a role in making sure that those institutions of empire and church remain unified. And so this is a power move by Constantine. And this sets the stage for the third phase of the Arian controversy, that which occurs after 325, because the council ended up solving nothing. The divisions only get more intense. Now, initially, this is largely an Eastern problem. People in the West didn't really care about Arianism. If you don't speak Greek, it's really hard to understand what this argument is even about. If you don't know what an ousia is, there is no real good antecedent in Latin. And so, for people who spoke only Latin, this is kind of an abstraction. I mean, it's an abstraction for most people who speak Greek as well. But the word about which they're arguing doesn't even exist in Latin. And so this really starts as an Eastern problem. But eventually this becomes an empire-wide problem. And part of this has to do with what happens after the death of Constantine. Now, Constantine had a very interesting idea about how he wanted the empire to continue after his death. Constantine very firmly believed that he was a very important and very special person. And because of this, Constantine decided that it was all right for him to be the supreme emperor in the Roman state and to overthrow the tetrarchy because he, of course, was special. He, of course, was important. But Constantine actually also understood in his megalomania that other people were not as good as Constantine, and in particular his sons were not as capable as Constantine. And so for the last few years of Constantine's life, he set up basically a kind of new version of the Tetrarchy. Now you see on these coins this new Tetrarchy laid out. All of these coins have the exact same back. They all on the back say the glory of the armies. But on the front you see different representations of these figures. So Constantine had three sons. He could have, if he wanted to, divided the empire in three ways. But again, he's committed to this idea of a tetrarchy, going back to a system that Constantine actually thought worked pretty well, just not for him. And so, for the last few years of Constantine's life, Constantine describes himself as Constantinus Maximus Augustus, Constantine the Supreme Emperor. And then beneath him are four figures. His nephew, Dalmatius, who is called the Noble Caesar, his son, Constantine Jr., so Constantinus IUN, this is the second coin, again, Noble Caesar. Constans, another son, Noble Caesar, and Constantius, a third son, Noble Caesar. This is Constantine's idea of a tetrarchy. Each of these four people, his three sons and his nephew Dalmatius, will receive a segment of the empire, roughly corresponding to the old tetrarchic divisions. And so Constantine firmly believed that when he dies, he as the sole, superior, supreme Augustus dies, the empire will just revert back to the tetrarchy that existed before he destroyed it. This is, of course, incredibly naive. Constantine dies in 337, and immediately, people working under Constantius kill Dalmatius, and not only kill Dalmatius, but they kill all of the other male relatives of Constantine except for the future Emperor Julian and Julian's brother Gallus, both of whom, Gallus's case, he was sick, so they felt that it wasn't necessary to kill him, and in Julian's case, he was so young that they felt like he was good to kind of keep around in reserve, but he wasn't a threat to anybody. And then the three sons rule the empire, not as a tetrarchy, but as a kind of divided monarchy. So after the murder of Dalmatius, Constantius and Constans divide his territory, making Constantine II particularly angry. And then Constantine II attacks his brother Constans. They fight a civil war. Constantine II loses the civil war, and then Constans takes over his territory. And from the early 340s until 350, Constans controls 2/3 of the empire, and Constantius II controls 1/3. Now, Constans himself is murdered in the year 350. Constantius goes to war against the killer, and eventually Constantius alone, from 350 until his death in 361, controls the entire Roman Empire as an Augustus. And so what we see is Constantine's idea completely falls apart. It is in some ways not surprising that Constantine would refuse or be unable to see the implications of going back to a system that he himself had destroyed and leaving it to his sons, who of course wouldn't feel like they were all that inferior to Constantine, to try to superintend a system that Constantine himself felt he was too good for. So from 350 to 361, Constantius II runs the entire empire. But Constantius recognizes that this is too complicated a task for one person to do. And so almost immediately after the defeat of Magnentius, the general who had killed his brother, Constantius appoints his cousin, Gallus, to run the eastern half of the empire while Constantius campaigns in the west. And so politically, we need to understand that what Constantius has acknowledged is the empire remains too complicated for one person to run. He needs a deputy. And part of the problem that Constantius confronts is the fact that the Arian crisis makes it much more complicated than probably Constantine ever imagined for a Christian emperor to run the empire alongside what's supposed to be a unified Christian church. And part of the issue is that the Arian idea, and by the time we're in the 350s, what Arians are teaching and what people are grouping under the heading of Arianism is not anything that Arius actually taught. It's not actually something that Arius would even on some level accept. But Arian traditions and Arian hierarchies were becoming dominant in the eastern half of the empire. Gallus himself was very closely associated with Arian teaching. And we can see this degenerate. We can already see this degenerating starting in the 330s. So we see, for example, that even while Constantine was still around, while Constantine was still alive, he was very interested in figuring out a way to end this controversy by co-opting Arius himself. And so Constantine actually summons Arius to Constantinople, to the imperial palace, and asks him whether Arius would agree to the Council of Nicaea. And Arius absolutely says, he says absolutely yes. We're told this is a source that's hostile to Arius, but this source says that Arius absolutely, without hesitation, replied in the affirmative and signed a declaration of faith in the emperor's presence. And so this is an actual event. Arius comes to Constantinople. He's asked, will you accept Nicaea? He says yes. He signs a document saying that he accepts it. But then something interesting happens. This source that is a anti-Arian source, a Nicene Christian source, then adds something quite interesting. But Arius was acting with duplicity, and the emperor, surprised at his ready compliance, obliged Arius to confirm his signature by an oath. And this Arius did with dissimulation. And the way he evaded it, I have heard, was this. He wrote on a piece of paper his own opinion and carried it under his arm, so that he then swore truly that he really held the sentiments he had written. And that this is so, however, I've written from hearsay. But that he added an oath to a subscription, I have myself ascertained from an examination of the emperor's own letters. And the emperor, being convinced, ordered that he should be received into communion by Alexander, the bishop of Constantinople. And so what we have here is Arius goes to the emperor. He writes out a statement of faith saying that he accepts the Council of Nicaea. He signs this. He then swears an oath saying that he accepts what he's written. And all of these things are actually true. There is actually, Constantine's letters, Socrates says, actually say this. They demonstrate this. And the emperor is convinced and he orders that Arius should be received into communion. But then there's something interesting that Socrates adds. Socrates adds, I heard someone say that Arius actually wrote his own opinion, which was different from what he wrote on this confession of faith, and he held it under his arm, and that's how he got around not lying when he swore this oath. Now, if you look at Socrates' sources, they're terrible, right? There's written documentation that Arius met with the emperor, that he agreed to accept Nicaea, that he wrote out a statement of faith that accepted Nicaea, that he signed it, and that he swore an oath saying that this actually was what he believed. And the letter and the documentation for this is really robust. The emperor's own letters say this. Socrates saw the written evidence that this is what happened. But Socrates doesn't want to believe it. And he doesn't want to believe it because he wants and he understands that Arianism is separate from the tradition that Socrates subscribes to. And Arius himself represents that separate tradition. And so Arius cannot come back into communion. He cannot actually want this, because that would mean that the separation is much more complicated. It means that Arius is not a villain. It means he's a human who had a change of heart. It means that he's a person who actually valued bringing the church back together. And Socrates can't have him do that. And so Socrates includes this hearsay evidence based on nothing but the words of someone that have been bouncing around for, at this point, Socrates is writing almost 90 years later, that have been bouncing around for more than 90 years. But Socrates wants Arius to be this duplicitous person, and so he accepts the hearsay evidence, even though he must also accept the written evidence that Constantine provides. And so how does Socrates prove that this hearsay evidence is right? Well, Socrates says, this happened on a Saturday. And Arius was expecting to go to church on the next day, but divine retribution overtook him. For when he was going out of the imperial palace, attended by a crowd of partisans who also were Arians, like guards, he proudly paraded through the middle of the city, attracting the notice of all the people. And as he approached the place called Constantine's Forum, where the column of porphyry is erected, a terror arising from the remorse of conscience seized Arius, and with the terror came a violent relaxation of the bowels. And he therefore inquired whether there was a convenient place nearby, and he was directed to the back of Constantine's Forum, where there was a public latrine. And he hastened to that point, and soon after a faintness came over him, and together with the evacuations his bowels protruded, followed by a copious hemorrhage and the descent of his small intestines, so that he almost immediately died. And Socrates says, you actually can still go and visit the latrine where Arius died in this way. And so Socrates tells us this story because to him this is proof. This is proof that Arius actually had nefarious motives. He didn't actually accept Nicaea, and God punished him for it. Now, the bowel story aside, I think it's important to see from a more balanced perspective that Constantine, Arius, and even the people who are seen as Arian partisans are looking in the 330s to bring the church back together. And all of them really valued this. And what's commonly forgotten is by this point, the movement that Arius had begun with his teachings in the church and in his one church in Alexandria had really gone far beyond his control. He was not the leader of this movement. He didn't even agree with much of what was happening in this movement at that point. In a sense, Arius had very little to do with what's called Arianism now after the 320s. The movement became something that was used by powerful bishops to try to carve out power bases in the church. And this is why Arius wanted to agree with Constantine. He wanted to bring the church back together because to him, that ultimately was more important than any little quibbling about doctrinal ideas. The unity of the church was something Constantine wanted, but it was also something that Arius wanted. But it was already too late. We have a history of this from Socrates Scholasticus, who's a Nicene historian, but we also have a historian writing from the Arian perspective, who talks about what happens in the 4th century. And the movement, the Arian movement, kind of taking on this life of its own as a movement separate from the congregations and the church of bishops who supported Nicaea, is something that Philostorgius describes as coming from a man named Aetius. Philostorgius says that Aetius, so before Aetius, the Arians, though they differed in their doctrinal statements from those who preached the Catholic faith, were nevertheless accustomed to be in the same place with them in prayers, hymns, deliberations, and in everything except for communion. As soon, however, as Aetius came and began the contention on these points about whether they should actually be together, he persuaded the multitude of his followers to break the bands of amity and friendship which had formerly bound them to the Homoousians, these are the Nicenes, and to set themselves up as a faction in opposition to them. And so up until Aetius, and this is the generation after Arius, up until that point, you could believe the ideas of Arius and the teachings of Arian bishops, but you still would go to church with other people who didn't. You would go to church with Catholics, and you would sing the same hymns, and you would pray with them, and you would listen to the same sermons, and maybe you didn't take communion from bishops who didn't agree with you Christologically, but maybe you did. And what Aetius did was he came in and he said, we must separate. We believe something different, and that means we cannot be in the same church as these Catholics. Now, Arius had never said that, and a lot of the initial supporters of Arius didn't say that either. And this is why Arius was so horrified. He saw where this was going. He saw that this separation, which he did not want, was something that could come about because of the theological division. But it's with Aetius that the separation actually begins. And by the time Aetius is doing this, the controversy was ripe for someone to come in and say what he was saying. And Aetius, we're told, was exactly the sort of person who would do this. Aetius was brilliant, a great philosopher, someone who was very, very smart, and someone who was very charismatic, but he was also somebody who was kind of badly tempered. And so Aetius became very, very skilled in arguing. And this was the cause of more than ordinary ill will being aroused against him. So as long as his teacher, the Bishop of Antioch, was alive, the teacher could keep him under control. But after Paulinus, the Bishop of Antioch, died, the next person who was appointed basically couldn't control Aetius, and Aetius didn't respect this person. And so Aetius's foul temper and bad behavior and love of argument broke out in such a way that Aetius was banished from the city of Antioch. But Aetius then began arguing again and again that the church, if it's to be true to its confessions and to its faith, must separate. And Aetius, like someone who was motivated incredibly strongly by this, would go everywhere and argue against his adversaries and argue in public disputes with people who supported Nicaea and beat them because he was so good at these arguments. But when he won, he would also argue that the church must separate. And this was a particularly problematic argument. This was what Constantine, Arius, and all of the people of that generation feared most greatly, is that, like the Donatists in North Africa, who were separated by an issue of resistance, the Arians in the East would also create a separate hierarchy. And this is what Aetius did. He created a separate hierarchy. So a Nicene source says that Aetius was held in high esteem among the heterodox, the heretics, in the words of Sozomen. He was a dialectician, apt in syllogism and proficient in disputation, and a diligent student of such forms, but without art. He reasoned so boldly concerning the nature of Christ that many people gave him the name atheist, a play on his name Aetius. Now, to Nicenes, Aetius is a terrible figure. But to the people who followed him or were persuaded by him, Aetius is the leader of a movement that, like the Donatists, is pure in its convictions and therefore must, to remain pure in its convictions, separate from the less pure ideas of other people in the church. Now, this is the situation that Constantius began to face seriously in the 350s, a church that was splitting. And Constantius himself was a moderate Arian. He supported the Council of Nicaea, and he did not support Aetius. But Gallus, the Caesar that Constantius had put in charge of the Eastern Mediterranean, Aetius became acquainted with Gallus, and Gallus liked what Aetius was saying. And it seems likely that as Aetius obtained the esteem of Gallus by means of these disputations, he devoted himself even more eagerly to these pursuits in order to progress in the favor of the emperor. And so what Aetius was doing was cozying up to Gallus. And so the threat that the Arianism of Aetius might actually overwhelm even the structures of the empire. It might overwhelm even the resistance in the West to these kinds of ideas. This became really, really significant. And so what Constantius tried to do was, after Gallus had some problems administering the East, and Constantius actually ended up having to kill Gallus because Gallus was working so inefficiently and ineffectually in running the East. After Gallus fell, Constantius tried very hard to find some kind of a theological compromise that could chart a middle path between Nicene Christians and Arians. But this meant that Constantius needed to be particularly hard on extremists. And so Constantius sends Aetius away. But Constantius also has to act against Nicene bishops like the Bishop Athanasius, who were strongly resistant to compromise from the Nicene side. And so, this idea of one church, one emperor, one God is something that Constantius, like his father, felt very strongly about. But the divisions in the church, and you see here a description of how Constantius is trying really hard to find some kind of compromise that can hold the church together. These distinctions in the church by the 350s had become so pronounced that the church was not going to be able to come back together. What you had was a broad middle ground of Christians who liked being in communion and liked being in the same congregation as other Christians. And maybe they thought differently about certain Christian ideas. Maybe they thought differently about the nature of Christ. But many of them still wanted to be in the same congregations they grew up in. But there were extremists on both sides now. There were Nicene extremists who felt that nothing except for the absolute and pure acceptance of the Council of Nicaea would be acceptable. And there were Arian extremists like Aetius who felt that nothing but the complete renunciation of any communion or interaction with people who accepted Nicaea would be acceptable. And Constantius found himself in the middle. And so what we see is by the end of his reign, the divisions are such that it's impossible to bring these groups back together. And what we see in the literature that comes 2 generations later, the works of Sozomen, Philostorgius, and Socrates, is even the people who tried to effect compromise are harshly criticized. Arius is attacked, and you are told that Arius operated in this realm of divine punishment because he tried his best to put together some sort of a compromise that could bring the church and keep the church together. Constantius is attacked for the same reason. Even Gallus is attacked for the same reason. Each of these traditions now see the other group. They see the Arian tradition, see the Nicenes see the Arians as people who are outside of their community. And so the idea of one church, one emperor, one God by the 350s, a decade and a half or so after the death of Constantine, is no longer something that's sustainable. This doesn't mean that emperors won't try. And emperors will try to do this for the entire history of the Roman Empire moving forward. But they will not succeed in creating this kind of cohesive view of what Christianity is that supports the emperor in the way that Constantine intended. So does this represent decline? Well, in one way, you could say absolutely it does. The Christian community loses the kind of resilience that it had in the 3rd century. It loses this push towards theological compromise. The idea of one church supported by one emperor means that there are significant things at stake if you lose one of these arguments. And so that creates increased barriers to theological, Christological, and hierarchical conflicts being resolved in the way that they perhaps could have in the 3rd century. But at the same time, the church becomes far more powerful, even in this division, than anyone could have imagined at the time of Constantine's conversion. By the death of Constantius in 361, major cities have started to tip to majority Christian cities, Alexandria being the first, but probably Antioch not far behind. Regions like Egypt are nearing the tipping point, and within another generation and a half or so, the empire itself will tip between a pagan majority and tip into a Christian majority state. And so while there are significant consequences to the church, and significant negative consequences to what Christianity will become and the ability of Christians to worship together in the way that they had before, some elements of Christianity really do accelerate and become more powerful because of this. And so again, as we've been talking about throughout these lectures, decline is something that is relative. Progress can exist alongside decline. It just matters how one is looking at things.